Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And in this video, we are focusing on a trilogy of films that Ingmar Bergman wrote but did not direct during the 1990s. Now, all three of these films focus specifically on Bergman's family, namely his parents, and their relationship before he was born, and then when he came into the picture, and then sort of as the years progressed. It's a really unique decision that he took here to step away from the camera and, spend time crafting the storyline. It's not based entirely on fact. It's sort of based on a combination of what Bergman knew about his history and then sort of a fictionalization.
It's interesting to watch Bergman's priorities shifting. Whereas before he was always focused on kind of external influences and what made him an artist, what made his stories, his films, and his characters. Here we really see an exploration of the past of others, and it's an origin story that goes much further back than just his own existence.
The trilogy begins with The Best Intentions, which is a 4-part miniseries that aired on television in Sweden and was later truncated into a theatrical release. That's followed up by Sunday's Children, which is sort of a sequel, and then the final film in the trilogy, Private Confessions. Now, we could have spoken about each one of these films by themselves, but rather than isolate them, we agreed that there were a lot of themes between them that were significant. The fact that Bergman, of course, was not behind the camera. This all lended to giving us sort of a glimpse into exactly where Bergman was at this point in his life. For me, The Best Intentions was actually a very impactful film, and I know that for a lot of viewers this is going to be quite a challenge considering that each one of the 4 parts is about 90 minutes. But I really have to encourage everyone to take a look at this because it really did, for me, give a glimpse into Bergman in a different way. We've always sort of seen him focusing on the darkness, the questions of religion, those themes that sort of ate at his soul. But with The Best Intentions, we get another side of Bergman. We get a lot of tenderness, and I don't think that's ever something that he has really allowed onto the screen when he's been the director. There's definitely a lot of time and care that he has taken into portraying the story of his parents' love.
I think the softness that you're alluding to is kind of prevalent throughout the film. Unlike other couples that we've seen from Bergman films before, where there's actually a constant strife between them that's actually pulling them further and further apart. In this film, what he's actually showing us is that all of that turmoil is happening externally to the couple and actually works to drive them closer together. There's a tendency in the film to want the couple to end up together, for them to be in a union.
And that's what makes this so unique when you compare it to a lot of other Bergman's films, particularly in the 1960s and early 70s, where maybe you would want to see the couples together, but it was often the riffs between them that stood out. It was the relationships that were falling apart that were really prominent. Sunday's Children definitely shows us that it isn't necessarily a happy ever after story.
Or even necessarily at the beginning. I found Sunday's Children to be a fairly dark movie. It was actually kind of reminiscent of some of the earlier Bergman films where on the surface it seemed like it's happy. It's summertime, the sun is shining, the family's together, but there's this very dark and disturbing undercurrent. I think it's representative of kind of the hidden trauma of Bergman's childhood, and the character of Pooh in the film is Bergman as a child who's interacting with his parents, and there's this intrinsic mistrust and fear and anxiety that he has regarding his father, who's a very volatile figure in this film and very unpredictable with his anger and violence.
Yes, in fact, Sunday's Children in many ways, to me, reminds me of Fanny and Alexander, because you do have that child character as the observer and sort of the moral center of the film. But what makes this one different is that I think the character of Pooh recognizes the corruption that's going on around him. He sees all the wrongs, and unlike, say, in Fanny and Alexander, he is also a victim in many ways, or at least he's portrayed that way.
That's challenging, though. I feel a lot of the times when children are central at the film, they're always in a way vulnerable and sort of victimized. And in Fanny and Alexander, Alexander was definitely positioned in a way to seek pathos.
Yes, but the way that Pooh is presented in Sunday's Children, I think, is more of a stronger victim. When, for example, in Friend and Alexander, when the children are kidnapped, you're not so concerned that they're returned. You're more concerned with how the family is operating. And I think In Sunday's Children, Pooh is shown as a victim. He's bullied constantly. He's made a fool of, and you're automatically sympathizing with him just because of the way that the moments are portrayed and how he sort of stands there completely defenseless. I think it's presented differently than Fanny and Alexander in that respect.
Ultimately, I still think this is a story of family dynamics. As much as he's trying to reconstruct and make sense of the relationship between his parents, he is also exploring the filial bonds that existed back then and the paternal bonds that existed between his father and himself and the other members of the family. I think in that exploration, what he ultimately seems to be showing us is these moments that are opportunities for reconciliation. Because throughout the film, we see that the relationship with his father is very complex. There are moments where undeniably his father appears completely magnanimous. He is just a wonderful figure that is to be cherished and loved and obeyed in the best sense of the word. And at other times, he's a complete tyrant. And it's that paradox from a child's eyes perspective that, you know, you're constantly looking for approval, you're constantly looking to be loved and accepted and cared for by your father. And he's showing us these ups and downs in the film where there's a lot of really tender and kind scenes, like the time when they're stuck together in the rain or they're riding to the church together with a bicycle. And then there are other scenes that catch you completely off guard where he beats him on the ferry.
What Bergman does in Sunday's Children, though, is he looks into the future and shows the time when Pooh is a grown man and literally is nursing his father. It's his father who's on his deathbed, and the roles have literally been switched. You know, at one time when the father was commanding the child and had all the power, now it's Pooh that in many ways has the power. He tells his father that yes, they can have a relationship and that can exist, but he will never fully forgive him for what had traumatized him in his youth. He literally says to his father, "I'll be a companion to you, but we won't have emotion."
That broken bond is a consequence of the fact that when Pooh was growing up, his father was unable to establish a proper relationship that should be between a father and his child, especially a father and his son. There should be that natural bonding that happens, the natural understanding, a feeling of safety, a feeling of kind of modeling after your father. And because he wasn't the right kind of father for Bergman as a child, or for Pooh in this case, that bond never took place, and he wasn't able to mirror him, and he never took that with him into adulthood.
It's definitely clear that there is a strong resentment that he feels towards him. And I think the question of the roles of a father, of a mother in Sunday's Children transition into Private Confessions as well, where it is the mother that's sort of placed on the pedestal and put under examination, with the question being, what should a mother be doing? What is right for a woman in a marriage? And also, how do the mother and father dynamics play out within a family? And ultimately, I think that's really what Private Confessions is about.
It's interesting that in the third film of this trilogy, the kids don't really factor in. They don't appear in the film at all. It's a film about adults and their motivations and why they do the things they do and their anxieties and fears and neuroses. And the kids are only kind of referenced in the background. So we're in familiar territory again, in the sense that, you know, we have a female protagonist, and it's an exploration of her femininity, whether as mother or as wife or as lover, and how she deals with that in the various relationships that she has that either push her in one direction or another. I think what really piques these films, however, in particular, is the fact that we know that the characters he's showing us are his own visualizations of what his parents are and the influences that shaped his parents' life and therefore his own. I think for me, the most interesting thing about this trilogy, or each film individually, is that it's really a story of origins. He's going so far back to try to understand where he came from, why he came from there, how it shaped them, and how they in turn shaped him, and how he shapes his own creations. Because I think Bergman, even though he was a father in real life, he very much took a paternalistic approach to his art. He was a creator. He almost gave birth to that, to the films, to the plays. So it's interesting to see how he fabricates the past and the tenuous links that he thinks are there, which may or may not be.
It's interesting to see how Bergman actually portrays his mother in this film, because she operates as sort of a corrupter. I mean, it's her infidelity that triggers all of the events that happen. She has an affair with a young student, which affects her marriage, and in turn sort of makes her husband, in many ways, at least as I saw it, the feminine character in the film. He becomes ultimately powerless in many ways. He ends up concerned more about the children than she is, and I think that is a particularly important point, because it's the mother figure that usually nurses the child. Here she's completely careless. One of the reasons this stood out for me is that it's always been a question: how does Bergman perceive women? Are they saints or are they sinners? Does he view women as an equal? Does he view them as a lesser? Does he view them as the problem in his life?
I think it goes a little bit deeper than just that surface layer of corruption, i.e. she's a temptress, she's a sinner, she's unfaithful. It's also about layers of deception, because in order to reach that corruption, you have to deceive others. And in a way, you have to deceive yourself in order to be capable to do these things. One of the things that was particularly interesting to me and how the whole story unfolded is that despite the fact that it's clearly a journey towards origins and a search for truth, if you will, the way that all the details are given to us, we never really know what the truth is, because she always tells her story and how things came to be differently depending on which character she's talking to. Throughout the film, we see her provide 3 different accounts of how this affair began, why it began, and how it potentially ended. One story is kind of a confession that she gives to Uncle Jacob, who is a priest that has kind of looked after her since she was a young girl. Another story, she is also kind of a confession, this time to her husband, when she tells him about the affair. And the third story is between her and a really close friend. And each of them is different. In one story, she leaves her boyfriend. In another story, he walks out on her. The spark about how the affair happened is different. One time it happens in a summer cottage. Another time it happens when they went for a walk in the woods and they ended up in a barn. So we never really know how the affair began, who tempted who. Was it him that told her he loved her and then it sparked her passion? Or was it she as an older woman that came onto him and helped him to explore his sexuality? And because we don't have that truth, because we don't know what the real origin is, it corrupts the entire tale.
And I think in many ways that relates to this entire trilogy, because ultimately Bergman is creating a fictionalized version of reality here, and one that he knows has to resonate with the audience, but also remain true to him, remain true to his history, at least what he knows of it, and what he's been told of it from others. This is a uniquely intimate story for Bergman, and I think that's one of the reasons that he chose these skilled individuals to work behind the camera rather than himself. And these aren't just people who know what they're doing in cinema, but they're also people that he had a very close relationship with. For example, Best Intentions is directed by a famed director from the region. Also, his son does the second film in the trilogy. And of course, Lee Wallman gets behind the camera for the third. I mean, at least the last 2 directors here, you couldn't get much closer in terms of relationships with Bergman. One thing that I think made these films particularly stand out in Bergman's work is that they look and they feel different from most of his productions. There's a tone that was especially affecting to me, but also one where I felt like I was getting more personal in ways that his own films couldn't quite achieve. And I don't think that's knocking any of his past work.
It's important to talk about them and recognize that they're pretty pivotal in this time in his career. He did write all 3, so the Bergman-ness of these films is very strong. But in reference to our project, they're not essential because they're not actually directed by him and don't really fit the criteria of what we're trying to do. But we didn't want to ignore them altogether.
Yeah, and I think that if you were to watch one of them, I think Best Intentions is the most preferable choice. I think that reveals a different side of Bergman. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to join us next time when we are looking at In the Presence of a Clown. But in the meantime, you can head over to Facebook, post some comments, and like the page.
And subscribe to our channel on YouTube for more episodes.
And we will see you next time on Breaking Down Bergman.